All right. So last time you were here on Friday, you were looking at all the things that were going on the home front. So I just want to remind you that there is not universal support for the war really until at least Pearl Harbor. So one of the things that's kind of cool about FDR is that he is a political genius. He knows exactly what he is doing. And so, for example, this like very gradual shift from the Nine Neutrality Acts to then cash and carry, to then destroyers for bases, and then finally Lend-Lease. Nod your heads if you're following me. Remember what all those things are? This very gradual shift away from neutrality is done so carefully because FDR doesn't want to push the American people farther than he wants. The very beginning of the war, you can look at Roosevelt's private documents. Roosevelt always wanted the U.S. to get involved in the war on the side of Britain. He knew that Germany was the aggressor. He believed the U.S. had a special affinity for the British, a special connection with the British. He wanted us to get involved. He was best friends with Churchill. He wanted us to get involved. But he was not going to push the American people further than we were willing to go. And so, like I told you, I think on Wednesday about this speech he gave about Lend-Lease, you know, like, if your neighbor's house was on fire, you're going to make him pay for your garden hose? No, of course not. You're going to lend it to him and be happy. If he doesn't give it back to you, like, you'll still be glad your house didn't burn down, or so on. So he's going to very carefully lead us there. But there are still groups that oppose the war, and one of the most famous is the America First Committee, which is led by Charles Lindbergh, who became famous in the 1920s because he, not around the world, so the first solo transatlantic flight. So he flies from the U.S. to France all by himself, so he's really famous. And he is going to be, so their like famous slogan is millions for defense, but not a penny for foreign wars. The argument is that the U.S. should help to build up its own defenses, but should not get involved in this war that's not our fault, that's not our problem. You know, it doesn't matter how bad the war is, we don't want to get involved if it's not our problem. Which is interesting because Roosevelt's going to use that logic to support his advocacy for the Selective Service Act in 1940. Hold up, is the U.S. in the war in 1940? No, we are not. It's been going on for a full year. Remember, the war begins officially September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. Good job. So the U.S. is not involved in the war, but Roosevelt says we need to be prepared for defense. The war is not going well for England. We don't know if the Nazis are interested in world domination. Are they going to come to the U.S. next? We need to be prepared, and we need to build up our military. And so it actually passes, even though there's still a lot of animosity towards the idea of the war. So the first peacetime draft, there was a draft in World War I and in the Civil War, and it's not the first time draft. But it's the first time we ever began a draft when we were not currently in a state of war, which is a pretty big deal. But everything changed December 7th, 1941. So in this is of course the date that will live in infamy, or whatever it is that FDR says. And it's the day that the Japanese attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now the Japanese goal was pretty simple. They wanted to destroy U.S. naval capability in the Pacific so that they could take the territory that they wanted. Why does Japan want territory? They're a tiny volcanic rock of an island country. They have very little resources of their own, and they want more trade. They want to industrialize. They want to be a global industrial power like the British, like the Americans. But it's very difficult to do that, again, if you live on a tiny volcanic rock island, right? They have even fewer resources than the British do, and the British have very few resources. So that's saying something. So the Japanese are looking for territory. And so throughout the 1930s, the Japanese had been very, very aggressive. They invaded and occupied the Korean Peninsula and refused to back off. That's the Russo-Japanese War. Then they invade Manchuria, which they renamed Manchukuo, and refuse to back off. These are like blatant violations of like international sovereignty agreements. Like they're just taking over other countries, right? Germany did it. Germany takes over Poland and we go to war. But Japan is taking country after country and nobody's doing much about it. They then began to invade China proper, right? The so-called rape of Nanking, and they go on, and the Japanese are absolutely pillaging the Chinese communities, and there's all kinds of like elements of cultural genocide, just really rough stuff. And yet the world does nothing, partly because what's happening in the 1930s? The Great Depression. We have lots of other things on our plates. We are really worried about like feeding ourselves and stuff. So there's very little will in the U.S. to do much about it in the first place. It's kind of paralleling what's going on in Europe, right? Hitler is slowly gaining power throughout the 30s. It's not like nobody in Europe notices, but they're also in a depression and really don't have much will to do much about it. But what the U.S. does do is begin to enact sanctions against the Japanese in the 1930s. So first we reduce the amount of steel that we're willing to sell them. Then we reduce the amount of oil we're going to sell them. When they then finally go on, they make some big offensive in China. I can't remember now what it was. The U.S. in 1940, maybe it was 39, we enact an all-out embargo. We refuse to sell the Japanese oil, steel, or coal. Hey, what do you need if you want to be an industrial country? Oil, steel, and coal, right? So the Japanese now, they do have reserves. They've been buying up all the oil, steel, and coal they can for a long time. They've built up a lot of reserves. But now they face this choice, right? If we want to be an industrial country, we've got to take colonies, right? If we can't count on trade, we've got to have colonies. It's the only way we'll ever survive. If we take colonies, the U.S. will declare war on us. Right? They've already made it clear that if we try to take over the Philippines, for example, or take over French possessions in into China or whatever, that they're going to declare war. So if they're going to declare war on us no matter what, we should attack them first, cripple their fleet, take what we want, and hope they're not going to get involved. And you're going, that's a dumb assumption that the U.S. wouldn't get involved. But hold tight. It's not that dumb, because this is America, after all. And what is the first rule of America? Racism. And the Japanese are probably rightfully thinking that the U.S. is unlikely to want to expend significant amount of life or resources on taking care of the not white parts of the world, right? If the Japanese invade China, I mean, look what they invaded China for a really long time. Did we do much about it? We did not. So the Japanese are betting that if they can cripple us, take what they want, and then just fight us for a little while, that we'll just give up. Like, who in America is going to be willing to expend a lot of money in life on these not white territories, which probably makes a lot of sense, except for the fact that the Americans are also tend to be pretty vengeful. So once we've been attacked, we're not likely to let it go, you know? So that sort of counterbalanced all that. So anyway, the U.S. does have one significant fortune at Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor is a resounding success for the Japanese. We are absolutely surprised. There's a big conspiracy theory that FDR knew and allowed it to happen so we could get drawn into the war. I've seen zero evidence to support that theory, although it's interesting. So we are completely taken by surprise. They really do destroy almost all of our Pacific fleet, but the almost is important. Because although the Japanese knew that morning, they got intelligence reports that our aircraft carriers were not at harbor like they were supposed to be. Our aircraft carriers were out doing some sort of last-minute exercise they decided to try. They decided to attack anyway because most people at that time perceived aircraft carriers as basically being like cargo ships, their purpose was just to carry aircraft, from one place to the other, and then they'd get to the place and then the aircraft would take off. They're not actually a fighting ship, so they thought. As it turns out, in World War II and since, every major naval battle occurred not with two naval ships shooting, torpedoes at one another, but occurred where the two countries' navies that were involved couldn't even see each other. They were beyond the horizon from one another. But the naval battles were carried out by aircraft, right? So the aircraft carriers would then send out their planes to go and drop torpedoes to try to sink the other ships. So we were really lucky that our aircraft carriers were not destroyed, because that became then the basis for our Pacific Fleet. And in this new era of technology and war, it was a benefit for us. So after Pearl Harbor, the mood in America changes very quickly. We declare war on Japan immediately. And then in one act of honor in his whole life, go Hitler, Hitler declares war on the U.S. So again, we did not declare war on Germany, right? Because Germany didn't attack us, Japan did. But back in 1939, Germany, Italy, and Japan had signed the Tripartite Pact. They formed an alliance. And so when we declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on us. So that's how we end up at war with Germany. And you've already done all this about the War Production Board, increasing American productivity, full employment, and so on. Japanese internment, race riots, double V campaign. Okay, so here we go. So now the country has to face this really challenging choice. Who do we fight first? We are now officially involved in a world war, and it's way worldier than World War I was, right? World War I was really a European war, right? But this one is actually around the whole wide world. We're fighting two completely different empires in two completely different hemispheres. This is a really big challenge. So what do we do first? Well, you might think that we would go after the Japanese first, since they actually attacked us and all. But here's the logic. First, almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have coordinated attacks on pretty much every territory they wanted in the Pacific. The only Pacific island nations that they didn't take were New Zealand and Australia. but everything else, Malaysia, Indonesia, Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, or current day Laos and Cambodia, the rest of China, everything else, the Philippines, the Japanese take it within a week of Pearl Harbor. So what else is there for them to take exactly? Australia and New Zealand, right? I mean, not really much else. So the U.S. decides, okay, we can probably wait on that because, you know, also racism. And here's the thing, in Europe, what's happening? How's it looking for the British and the Russians, 1941? Really bad, actually, right? The Russians are about to just absolutely, you know, they've run out of people to run out of, you know, so they're really struggling. The poor British, you know, are like being bombed literally every single night for more than a year. The Battle of Britain. Can you imagine if your capital city was bombed every night? Can you imagine the disruption in the economy, the morale? You know, how can you as a people keep going this will to fight when you are clearly being beaten the smithereens out of, you know? The French don't even exist anymore. Like, this is a really, really challenging position. So the feeling in the United States was, if we don't jump in and help our allies in Europe, pretty soon our allies in Europe are going to be defeated. And then it's going to be literally us against the whole wide world, and that seems scary. So we decided on a Europe-first strategy. We're going to use only defensive action in the Pacific, just enough to stop the Japanese advance, and kind of ignore them otherwise for a while, and focus on helping our European allies first. So that's the first decision, Europe first. The next decision is, what do we do in Europe, right? How do we address, like, the Nazis have taken over the entirety of the European continent, every single bit of it. And what are we supposed to do about it? Well, the Russians have a really good idea. Well, they thought it was a good idea. What do the Russians want? What's the best way to defeat Germany? Open a two-front war, right? Germany struggles, and they have to fight like we were about to struggle, fighting in two separate fronts. So Russia says, open a second front, hold tight. Have you ever run on the beach, anybody? Is that fun to do, running on the beach? It's challenging, isn't it? I'd like for you to imagine for a moment, not running on the beach, but starting when the water is like chest deep, and then also running towards the beach. But imagine that you're wearing about 90 pounds of equipment. Oh, and you have a rifle that is like your lifeline, but it can't get wet. So you have to like hold it above your head. Oh, and I forgot one tiny detail. There are people on cliffs above you with machine guns shooting at you while you're trying to do this running with the 90 pounds and the rifle and the water. Sound fun? This is what I described to you is an amphibious invasion. You know, to open a second front, to like open a front in France, that's what we have to do. We have to land from the water onto the beaches while they have already had 3 years to fortify and shoot at us. That's what amphibious invasion looks like. Does that sound like it has a high probability of success? Certainly not when the Germans are at their absolute strongest, right? 1942, when we finally actually get to Europe, you know, December of 41 is when we declare war, but we're not actually there until the next year. So 1942, they've had 3 full years of dominance of Europe. The Germans are at their absolute strongest. So it's pretty much, that sounds like suicide to do that. The Russians really want us to do it because they're about to like die. They need some relief. But the U.S. goes, sounds really risky, and here's the most important part. The British say, listen, if we do that and it fails, we will fail. If the British invest in an attack like that and it fails, the British will have to drop out of the war, right? They're already really hurting. The people are struggling. Like, they knew they couldn't survive another loss. So the Americans instead decide on something. We make Russia really mad doing this, by the way. We decide on something called the soft underbelly approach. So what we do is we're going to go where it's a little easier to fight. We're going to land in North Africa. We do not have to make an amphibious invasion in North Africa. At most places, there's one small amphibious invasion, but they weren't really shot at when they got there. We're going to invade North Africa, and the troops in North Africa are primarily Italian. And sorry if you're Italian, but the Italians are not super good at war. Remember, they switched sides in World War I when they started losing. The Italians are not super good at war, and so we very quickly defeat what's left of the Italian army. Then the Germans send their best general, General Rommel, and the Panzer divisions and the tanks, and he's really good at his job, but he's running out of resources. The Germans are trying to keep attacking Russia, and so they don't send enough to North Africa. So we managed to defeat the Germans in North Africa. Then what's next? Well, now we're going to go soft underbelly, right? The easier targets. What we're trying to do here is 2 things. We're trying to weaken Germany, right? Just make them expend resources on us, weaken Germany, while also buying us time to figure out how the heck we're going to do the whole amphibious landing thing, right? So now we're going to attack Sicily, and then from Sicily we're going to work our way up the Italian peninsula. There are some of those who argue that we would go from Italy then into Switzerland and into Austria and into Germany, except for that there's this thing, the Alps. You might have heard of them, the tallest mountain range in all of Europe. They happen to cap off the northern part of Italy. We were never going to make it that far. But we were successful in making the Germans just sort of redistribute their resources. They had to reallocate divisions to try to fight against the U.S. in Italy, and that helps give a little bit of relief to Stalin and the Russians, who are finally able to turn things around. The Battle of Stalingrad. Officially, the Battle of Stalingrad is a victory for the Russians, but if you'd seen what Stalingrad looked like, you wouldn't call it a victory. Have you ever heard the phrase a Pyrrhic victory? It's from Greek mythology. It's like that you win, but there's nothing left to win, right? So Stalingrad, the Russians won, but the entire city is completely destroyed. There's literally nothing left. All the buildings are completely bombed out. Almost everyone has died or been evacuated. Like, the Russians win because the Germans were advancing so quickly that Hitler sent them to go and defeat the Russians, because defeat looked imminent without any winter provisions. You feel like they should have learned. It's not the first time the Russians have been attacked and winter has won. But so anyway, all that's going on at this time. So meanwhile, the Allies are going to get together at Casablanca. It's called the Casablanca Conference. But you'll notice somebody's missing. Our boy Stalin, right. So Stalin isn't able to make it because he's too busy trying to not die, as the Russians are trying to beat back the Germans. So instead, it's left to the U.S. and the British to decide what the major strategy will be. They decide on the soft underbelly approach. They decide that they're going to fight until they reach unconditional surrender. That means we're not going to let the Germans say, okay, we'll surrender if you allow us to X, Y, and Z. No. We're going to fight until unconditional surrender. And also decide some resource allocation questions. So it's interesting. We're kind of previewing the Cold War here, right? We know what comes next. After World War II comes the Cold War. And these are some of the beginnings of this tension that will come between Russia and the rest of allies. Sometimes students will go, well, how could we go from being allies in World War II to immediately being enemies? And there are definitely seeds of that within the way the war is fought. General Dwight Eisenhower, who will eventually become our president, is named as Supreme Allied Commander. That means that he was the general in charge of all of the Allied forces in the whole world. So over the British troops, the Russian troops, the Canadian troops, the sort of kind of French troops, but they don't actually exist. They're just sort of like rebels in France. Anyway, all of the troops, the soldiers that are going to answer to the U.S. or to the Allies are going to be under his command. Now, this is mostly symbolic. First of all, Eisenhower is an incredible general and did an incredible job. But they didn't really know that then. They knew he was a pretty good general. Most of this is political. Who do the Allies really, 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 really need? Us. They need the U.S., right? And so by naming, rather than naming like Montgomery, for example, a British general who was really well experienced, they named a U.S. general to sort of like symbolically say, we love you, USA, keep fighting, that's how it goes. Okay, I can't spend a lot of time on here, but I do want you to make sure you pay attention. There are lots of technological and scientific developments that are going to help aid in the Allied efforts. They have new bomb sites. This always blew my mind. So at the beginning of World War II, pay attention, we considered a bombing run a success if 10% of the bombs landed within 5 miles of the target. That was successful for us. By the end of the war, we considered a success if 50% of the bombs landed within 5 miles of the target, which is an improvement. It's still pretty terrible, but it's an improvement. So new developments in technology allowed that big improvement to occur and really just made us more accurate with our bombing runs. We have missiles being developed, so long-range bombs, basically, and this is going to quite literally propel the American space program after the war is over. We've got radar and sonar. Radar will almost single-handedly save Britain. So the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force coming to bomb Britain every night. The only reason that the British didn't totally collapse under all of that was because the RAF, the Royal Air Force, had this new technology, radar, that everyone thought was crazy, but it worked. And they were able to therefore see the Germans coming. And so the much smaller and less experienced RAF forces had half a chance trying to defeat some of the German airplanes as part of the process. Aircraft carriers we talked about, we developed synthetic rubber because the Japanese control most of the places that we had harvested natural rubber from. And then, of course, there are nuclear bombs that are developed. Interestingly, nuclear weapons were developed at the behest of a German immigrant, Albert Einstein, right, who wrote to President Roosevelt directly and saying, Mr. Roosevelt, you have to know the Germans have engineers working on this program. We've got to do one ourselves or they'll get it first, and then the war will be over. And so the U.S. recruits pretty much every possible scientist they can find, almost all of them immigrants, right? So Fermi, for example, who's going to be one of the leaders of the program itself, they bring them together at the Manhattan Project. They work Los Alamos, New Mexico. They create like this whole like community just for these scientists. They're not allowed to talk to anybody besides like themselves. And even within the scientific community, they're banned from talking about their work at all. And only about 5 people, not including the president didn't even know all the details. Only about 5 people knew what the actual plan was. So instead, Caroline would be given, okay, here's your one tiny job. Y'all, this is so beyond my ability to explain. I have no idea. Your job is to do this one technical thing. And your job, Spencer, is to do this one other technical thing. And they weren't even allowed to talk about, hey, here's my project. What's your project? Because these are all brilliant people, right? And if Caroline knew her project and she knew what Spencer's project was and she knew what Andrew's project was, they could maybe put together, ooh, I know what we're making. But they weren't allowed to talk. There were like U.S. government spies stationed all around in Los Alamos to make sure that they never spoke of their work to anyone other than the people who were actually working on what they were doing. We eventually do, obviously, you know the answer to the story, make the atomic bomb. The Germans don't, although they got fairly close, closer than we thought they did. But the Germans eventually had to divert resources away from the program because they had to try to focus on winning the war. But so there was real concern there. Okay, so we're going to go fairly quickly, well, we're doing pretty quickly already, through the actual military aspect of the war. I have like so many stories I want to tell you, but I can't really tell you any of them. So we'll just kind of go through the big picture here. I did not make all these animations, but it's kind of interesting, so I like to use them. So here's the beginning of the war. The Nazis take over. They militarize the Rhineland. This is a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but it's also the middle of the Depression, you know, and so Europe is like, it was a really dumb treaty anyway. We don't really want to do anything. It's fine. And then there's the Anschluss, right? The Germans take over Austria. Hello, Sound of Music. And it's like, well, the Austrians didn't complain, and this is the Depression, so fine. And then Hitler begins to say, we need Lebensraum, we need more territory in Czechoslovakia, and that's naturally Germanic territory anyway. And the country's like, are you sure, Hitler, that you don't want any more territory? And this is the Munich conference, you know, and Chamberlain is there. And Hitler's like, absolutely, I totally don't want any more territory at all. This is all I will ever want. And Chamberlain's like, awesome, let's sign this agreement. We'll be totally good friends. And so the poor Czechoslovakians get sold out to the Germans. And of course he takes over all of Czechoslovakia. That happens pretty quickly. And now the Polish people are getting really nervous because Hitler's been saying all kinds of terrible things about Polish people. They have a high Jewish population, and they're going like, oh my gosh, Europe, don't let Germany take us too. He's going to do bad stuff. And Britain is like, no, don't worry. We would never let him take over. He's not going to take. He promised us he only wanted Czechoslovakia. And then wouldn't you know, that on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland and World War II begins officially. And then they take over a whole bunch of other stuff. Oh, here's a fun story. I will tell you one. So the French are a little bit nervous about the Germans, you know, since having lost World War I and having been militarily hurt during World War I and all. So the French are like, hey, you know what would be awesome? Let's build the world's best defense along the entirety of the border. Let's call it a wall even. Between France and Germany, it'll be impenetrable. It's going to be like 5 miles of cleared land. There's going to be mines. They're going to have tank traps. We're going to have like this big, massive wall. It's going to have sentries stationed and machine gun nests. And like underground, we're going to have bunkers where we can have a whole bunch of troops that are there and tanks ready for them. They'll never be able to cross this ever. Well, they didn't. They just went around. So the Germans just invaded Belgium instead. And we're like, cool, we're going to take over anyway. This line I told you about was called the Maginot Line. And this personal story I was going to tell you is both of my granddads, fought in World War II. My dad's dad fought in the Marines in the Pacific, and my mom's dad was a tail gunner in the U.S. Air Force flying raids over Germany. And so my mom's dad, he was tail gunner, and his plane was shot down, but he only knew it was shot down because from his post in the very back of the plane, he saw his pilot and co-pilot parachuting to the ground below, and he thought that was probably a bad sign. It turned out that all the fight they were in, one of the bullets had been shot at them, had severed the communication lines between him and the front of the plane, so he didn't hear when they said it was time to bail out. So he grabs his parachute and jumps out the hole in the plane that was not supposed to be there. And broke his collarbone because he didn't get his backpack all the way on, so he was holding onto his parachute with one arm, and whatever. But so he lands, and they were taught, how to hide all their stuff, and so the goal was, so they were shot down over Germany. The goal was to get to France, right? France is also controlled by German allies, the Vichy French, but there were many free French, revolutionaries in France that would be willing to help the Americans. So the goal was try to get to France. And so he stowed away his parachute. He hid in fields during the day. He walked little by little, at nighttime, evading. He made it all the way to the Maginot Line. But then he had to try to cross the whole thing in one night, right? Because if daybreak came and he was in the middle, well, there's nowhere to hide, right? I just told you it's this big 5 miles clearing. There's nowhere to hide there. And he made it about 2/3 of the way across, but then daybreak came. Because he can't move that fast, because the sentries will come, you have to be still, or the light comes through, you have to be still. And so anyway, he didn't make all the way across, so he was captured. He was a prisoner of war for 2.5 years. But that's what the Maginot Line did, really. It was just made it harder for Americans to get into France. Okay, so now the Battle of Britain begins. The poor British are going to be really suffering. Here comes radar, and the RAF are going to try to help and do all of that business. I don't actually know what's happening here. Oh, more stuff. Eastern Europe. Congratulations. 1941, here we go. Poor Soviets or Russians are now going to be under attack, right? Now that Germany has secured all of the rest of Europe, they're going to turn against their former allies, the Russians. So now the Russians are going to try to sort of hold that back. Here comes the U.S., 1942. This is Operation Torch. The U.S. is going to get involved taking back Northern Africa. Then we're going to finally kick the Nazis out there. Then we're going to fly and take over Sicily. We talked about this already. Then comes Italy. Now that the Germans have to divert some resources to help stop us in Italy, the Russians are able to make a little bit of progress. We began these massive bombing runs over Germany and pretty much all German-held territory. Interestingly, this is one of the first instances of total war on this industrial scale. You might remember Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War, nod your heads. Was his objective military? Was he trying to find armies and defeat them? No, his objective was just to destroy stuff, right? To reduce the population's will to fight. That was really what most of our bombing missions were about, and it's really controversial because lots of civilians are killed, lots of cultural sites are damaged. But the purpose here was really just to absolutely bomb them into submission. And so we're going to continue to carry out those raids, all in preparation, of course. Lots and lots of bombing for the D-Day invasion. So Operation Overlord is the fancy name for the D-Day invasion. It's the only real battle you need to know from the European theater. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. This is June 6th, 1944. And so we're going to make this tenuous landing. I have so many cool stories to tell you about D-Day, but it's not going to be today. And so we managed to finally be successful there. And from then on, it's kind of like just a matter of time for the Germans. So now the Russians are making progress in the east. Now that we have a toehold in France, the Americans and the British are going to be able to, remember, Germany is weak. They're running out of supplies. They're having to divide their resources. They're really struggling. So we then begin to make some progress. We retake most of France. We get almost to the German border. The Germans are going to sort of fight back with a really big offensive push called the Battle of the Bulge. You guys have played Red Rover? The game where you hold, it's a terrible game. You literally will break your arm. Don't do it. But the point of Red Rover, right, is to push through and break through, make people let go of their hands, and then you win or whatever. Well, what the Germans were trying to do was to push through and break the American lines. And then if they broke through, they could attack us from behind as well as from the front, right? And then we would have problems. And it almost worked. But at a very important moment, the U.S. Army is in disarray. We're all kind of scattering. The Germans run out of fuel temporarily. They have to halt for about 24 hours while they wait for more fuel to be brought to the front lines. And that halt was just long enough for the American forces to reorganize, and we stopped the Battle of the Bulge. But it was sort of dicey there for a minute. But after that, the war is over. We take over Germany. VE Day, woohoo! And then we divide it up, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, in the Pacific, things look a little differently. So, although the Japanese take almost everything within a week of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. manages to hold on to a tiny portion of the Philippines at Corregidor for about another year. But then ultimately, the Japanese take even that part. This is the famous or infamous Bataan Death March. So all the Americans who are captured there are going to be forced to march something like 17 days without any rations. The only water they get is rainwater and dew that they're able to collect. Anyone who falls behind is shot. Incredibly brutal. The Japanese are well known at this point among American servicemen for being hugely abusive to prisoners of war, that they just didn't take any quarter, that they were going to be absolutely. And so this contributes to already racist imagery of the Japanese as being inhumane or inhuman and savage or whatever. So the Japanese are going to continue to try to advance, and eventually they try to expand their reach to include the U.S. territory of Midway, as well as then potentially the Hawaiian Islands, which you might not realize how far away Hawaii is from the U.S., but it's really far away from the U.S. So the Japanese are sort of making this advance. The Battle of Midway is the one battle you need to know in the Pacific Ocean. So this happened in 1942. And interestingly, the Japanese thought they were setting a trap for us. They thought this was going to be the battle where they were going to defeat what was left of the American Navy in the Pacific, and they were going to be able to then do whatever they wanted to. But luckily for us, U.S. cryptographers, including lots of women were given lots of these clerical cryptography kinds of jobs, and so there was a lot of sort of opportunities in this area. U.S. cryptographers are able to figure out the Japanese code, so we know that they're setting a trap for us. So we trap their trap. So we trap them in the trap that they set for us, and we're able to defeat a major part of the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. And so Midway is important because it marks the last time the Japanese will be on the offensive. After this, the Japanese are playing a purely defensive war. They're just trying to hold on until we'll give up. As a result, though, the Japanese strategy, remember, the Japanese aren't dumb, right? Sometimes my students will say something like, Mrs. Rodriguez, how did the Japanese think they could defeat the U.S.? We were way bigger, we have way more resources, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer is they didn't. Remember, they were expecting the U.S. would give up, that we wouldn't be willing to expend so much life and resources on a war for territory that we didn't care about, or people that we didn't care about. So the strategy the U.S. has to adopt is something called island hopping. This means two things. First of all, it means that we do skip some islands. We just decide if this island is not strategically important, we're going to kind of skip it. We'll isolate it using some small naval craft to like keep the Japanese on that island from like messing with us, but otherwise we'll kind of ignore it. But it also means that we have to take tiny island by tiny island, every part of the supply chain, every island that controls major sea thoroughfares. You know, we have to pass boats or ships through to get supplies to different places. Tiny, like totally pointless, worthless, tiny little stupid islands. We take every single one of them. And P.S., what does an island mean? It means every single one of them is an amphibious landing. The wading through the water and the 90 pounds of gear and the rifle above your head and the shooting at you from the beach. Like every single stupid island had to be taken in this incredibly bloody battle. And it seemed senseless to the Americans because it was clear when the Americans decided to take an island, we were going to take it. We had vastly more resources than the Japanese did. For every like 2,000 tons or 2,000 pounds, so every ton, or every American had 2,000 pounds, 1 ton of supplies behind them, right? Like that the U.S. was like producing for them. So medical supplies and food and ammunition and so on and so forth. Every Japanese soldier had something like 37 pounds. 2,000 pounds per soldier versus 37 pounds, like in terms of like the entire productive capacity. There was no choice, there was no question we were going to win the island. So why wouldn't the Japanese just surrender? You know, why did they keep fighting when it was beyond the possibility they could possibly win that island? And the answer is, back to that game of bloody knuckles, right? What does the Japanese want us to do? Give up and accept their terms of surrender. Because if they get to keep anything, they win, right? If they get to keep anything they took, they get more than they started with, and that's a victory for them. So they just wanted to make every stupid island a terrible battle for us in hopes that we would just give up. We'd get tired of it and we would sue for peace and be willing to allow them to keep something, which makes it a very challenging war. Well, not like any war is not challenging, but this was really psychologically damaging for a lot of soldiers because of this incredible like death that was faced. In 1945, we finally reached Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These two islands are really important for two reasons. The first of which is that Okinawa is considered by some to be one of the Japanese home islands. Like, you know, that Japan is an archipelago, right? So it's a series of islands, not just one big island. And so Okinawa is considered by some to be part of the actual mainland, or like main part of Japan. But more importantly, these two islands are close enough to Japan that we can allow fighter pilots to escort our bombers as they go to bomb Japan. So just like Germany had been bombing Britain over and over and over again, the U.S., as soon as we got close enough, was bombing Japan regularly. We use fire bombs, which are fueled by napalm primarily, so like jellied gasoline. It's really intensely burning. It's horrendous stuff. And of course, most traditional Japanese architecture is wood and paper, right? So these are incredibly flammable cities. It is hugely destructive, and again, has a huge civilian toll. Many people would try to escape the intense flames by like there's lots of like ponds in or like small bodies of water in Japan, but they try to run into the water to like save themselves, and they'd still die effectively like boiled to death, right? Like the fires burn so intensely hot. The bombing is really, most people don't talk about it much, but the U.S. bombing against Japan was hugely destructive and hurtful of civilian populations. But those missions were also, they were important because, again, the point is to bring the war to Japanese people, try to reduce Japan's will to carry out the war. But they were also dangerous because until we got close enough, the bombers had to go alone, right? And so there was lots of anti-aircraft and Japanese fighter pilots that would shoot down American bombers. Lots of missions were lost. as bombers tried to get there. But once we take Okinawa and Iwo Jima, now we can fighter planes are smaller, right? They have less fuel, they can't go as far. They go faster, which also means that they can't go as far because they have to use the fuel up faster. Anyway, so once we get there, fighter pilots can escort American bombing missions, which makes them safer, more successful, and so they're going to be able to do more of that. But then the question comes to the atom bomb, right? So 1945, we take in Okinawa and Iwo Jima. The next step is to invade Japan, right? Japan still won't surrender. And what do we agree to at Casablanca? We're going to fight until unconditional surrender. No conditions of any kind. Just absolutely, I'm at your mercy, I'll do whatever you say. Unconditional surrender. So there's this question, do we drop the bombs? Well, first of all, in April of 1945, FDR dies of brain aneurysm. And so now, new into the president game is Harry Truman, his vice president, who's going to have to figure out all this. Can you imagine the surprise? You're vice president, you have no idea that nuclear bombs even exist, and then you're like told, hey, by the way, we have these weapons. They're stronger than anything you've ever heard of in your entire life, and also, should we use them? Yes or no? Go. You know, it's a lot of pressure. And he decides on this basis. He says, what's the option? Well, we have to invade Japan. And some military experts were predicting huge death tolls on an invasion of Japan. They basically said, look, if the Japanese fought hard for every tiny, stupid, barren island in the Pacific, how hard will they fight for their own actual home island? They were anticipating really high death rates, both of American soldiers and of Japanese civilians. And Truman says, will the bomb make them surrender? And most people thought, yes, that if we use the atom bombs, that the Japanese would surrender. And so Truman says, okay, fine, let's use the bomb to avoid an invasion of Japan, to avoid that loss of life. My granddad, to the day that he died, my dad's dad who fought in the Pacific, would have killed me if I ever even suggested the idea that the atom bomb was a bad plan, because in his mind it saved his life, because he was scheduled to invade Japan if that was something that they were doing training missions for this to happen when he heard that the bomb had been dropped. So anyway, they decided to use the bomb. There are lots of controversies about it, though. The first bomb was dropped August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima, and then just 3 days later, August 9, 1945, the second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki. So one controversy is, why so soon, right? Like, if the bomb is hugely destructive, which we know it is, obviously all communications have been knocked out, so couldn't we have given them more than 3 days to, spread the word, look how destructive this bomb was? Maybe they would have surrendered after just one bomb instead of two. The U.S. Army's rationale was we only had two. We could have made another one within about a month. We only had two. We made 3. We tested 1, and we only had 2 left. And we wanted the Japanese to think that we could keep dropping them as many as we wanted, so that they would surrender rather than wait longer. Because if we only dropped 1 and we waited too long, they might think, oh, they only have 1. It's already been dropped. We don't have to surrender now, right? So that was the logic, the military logic behind dropping 2 of them so quickly together. There's that. Some people said we should have done a test bomb. We could have done off the coast of Japan somewhere, shown them the destructive capability. Maybe they would have surrendered without any loss of life as a result of the atom bomb. Maybe. The U.S. said, well, then we would have only had 1 left, and then what if that didn't work, and so on. Some people argue that the Japanese would have surrendered if we only allowed them to keep their emperor. Like if we had allowed them one condition, that you surrender, but we promise we won't execute your emperor, because the Japanese believed that their emperor was a deity. So that we could have gotten out of the war that way without any having to use the bomb, and that we only use the bomb to threaten Russia, because at this point we're already butting heads with the Russians over trying to divide up Germany and solve the problems in Eastern Europe. So maybe we're just trying to scare the Russians, or maybe we're just trying to use the bomb because we made it and we spent a lot of money on it and we just wanted to justify its use or to prove that we were fancy or whatever it was. But in any case, we use it. The Japanese, immediately after the bombing of Nagasaki, they do accept terms of unconditional surrender. The U.S. in the end allows them to keep the emperor, but requires the emperor to make a public address, which had never been done before. The people had never heard the emperor's voice or seen the emperor's face, and so all that sort of goes down. So in the end then, we will achieve victory around the world. The U.S. will emerge from World War II as the single global superpower. Our economy, unlike any other country in the world, our economy benefited from World War II, as opposed to most of the countries' economies were crippled by the war as they were destroyed by the devastation of bombs and so on and so forth. We're going to become the world's diplomatic leader. We get to shape the way the world is going to look after the war. We will pretty quickly begin butting heads with the Russians, but even in there we have the advantage of economic superiority as we move forward. So we have been successful all of World War II in 40 minutes. Congratulations to all of you. And when we come, let's say tomorrow, we're going to do the terms quiz, and then a little bit of essay practice, and then Wednesday will be the exam itself. So we're done.